Hi, my name is Miss Amber Stokely, and I'm here with another English 12B class. Today we're going to go over the H.B. Wells lesson, and that is the second lesson from Unit 3 of the course. So I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen. Just one moment here. Okay, here we go. This one's not as long of a lesson, but there is a lot of information to go over as usual in terms of the history. So I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. So this very first slide here is just about the background information about science fiction. So science fiction basically started in the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution. It was basically like a reply to the revolution. Now, in case you needed a reminder of what the Industrial Revolution is, it's basically a time when technology was moving forward and people were creating machines that made making things a lot faster. So that's what we call industrialization, because the industrial area of technology has to do with making more things faster. So if you're thinking like car factories is like an advanced invention of like the industrial progress, right? So we've got factories that are set up to make lots of things faster. And like it says here, it says the Industrial Revolution resulted in a major shift towards mechanized, that means using machines, production in factories and industries. So this had like a really big impact on British life in the 1800s. Now there are other lessons, if you've been a student with us for the other English courses that go over the Industrial Revolution and that talk about the effect that it had on British life. But as a summary, it was great for people who were making money and not great for people who weren't. So there were basically a lot of workers that moved into London where most of the factories were. They were forced to live multiple families, like in one house at a time. They built the places where people lived above or below the factories that they worked at so that workers wouldn't have to go very far to get to work. So having people crammed in space for their home life and crammed into space for work life led to health issues, as you can imagine. The biggest problem was like the creation of technology and pushing technology to another level made it so that people could live longer, but they were also sicker longer because they were forced to live in these terrible conditions. And if you worked in a factory, they expected you to work crazy hours, like basically 16 to 20 hours a day. They allowed children to work as well because just more bodies would make people more money. And people were not being paid good wages for the time. So they were forced to continue to work in the factory pretty much until they died and then were just replaced by someone else. So it was good in terms of the technology that came about because that's how we got to where we are today and we can do great things with that technology. But at the time, they were not using that technology to do great things in an ethical way that considered like the wellness of everyone. So people at the time who were living through that time period knew that there were big changes coming. Like no matter where you were, if you were upper class or lower class, it was pretty easy to tell like the way that people lived and worked was changing because of all of these things. So because the people were aware of this, a lot of people were unsure about what the future will hold and what would happen. Just knowing that things were going to be so different from the lives that their parents and grandparents lived, where they just were farmers or where educated people had to like take out loans or be sponsored to make things, and there were only so many of a thing. Because things were becoming so different, they didn't know what life for humans would be like later. And this section right here is how it's related to science fiction. So science fiction belongs to a group of storytelling that's called speculative fiction. And they give you the definition of it here. Speculative fiction is a broad genre, so it's like different types of storytelling that's quite ancient. So speculative means to think on something and imagine how it would be in the future. So imagining what the future is like is not something that only happened for the first time during the Industrial Revolution, but it only became widespread popping up in stories during this time. It includes genres, subgenres like historical fantasy. That's when you think about what history would be like if there were like magic or other races involved, like magical races, horror, and fantastic voyages. So if we're talking, like epic stories that people make up about the experiences that heroes have. And horror is something that's also quite old, just in terms of imagining the forces of the world in ways that we can't understand and being able to interact with them. So all of these things ask a sort of what if question with incidents and characters outside of the realm of known reality. So that's the point of speculative fiction. It's to ask that question, what if this crazy thing were possible? What would it be like? And then you tell a story that answers that question. Science fiction is one of the categories of writing, one of the genres that fits underneath speculative fiction, because it asks the question of what if technology evolved to a certain point? What would life be like then? Now here on slide 6, they give you some examples of science fiction and the questions, the what if questions it was trying to answer. So some of the, so it says science fiction had its share of what if questions. What if science replaced God? What if humankind were at the mercy of machines? Meaning like, what if machines took over and we had to answer to them? What if humans succeeded in discovering all of nature's secrets? So you have to remember that during this time, during the Industrial Revolution, this was like the Victorian era. So scientific theories were becoming popular, and this will be important to remember for later, but people were coming out of a religious time period. Some people still held very fast to religious values. So a lot of the technology that was coming up scared people. And at the time, people thought that there are just certain types of information and knowledge that humans are not supposed to know. So a lot of these what if questions have to do with, what are the negative consequences of humans having enough technology to play God or do things that God only is supposed to do. And it says here that modern science fiction, so that means science fiction today, has continued to ask these and other questions about human nature and society, as well as technological developments. And I mean, that's something that we all know is true. There are movies coming out all the time about what if we get enough technology to where we start a zombie apocalypse by accident. We have games that cover what do we do when AI, like artificial intelligence, becomes so good that we can make human-shaped androids that interact with us every day. All of these things are just our current today version of questions that were asked during this period of time. So in this bottom paragraph here, they talk about some of the common conventions and elements in science fiction stories. So they give you a list here. It says here they include space and time travel, robots, prophecies about future technology, and futuristic utopias. So they give you the definition of utopia here and dystopia here. So utopia is a perfect world, a world that's been made perfect by technology. And dystopias are miserably dysfunctional worlds. So these are worlds where we tried really hard to make things good, but they didn't work out in the worst way. And now humanity has to try to figure out how to survive under whatever circumstances happen from the big mess up. And then it says here, some authors even imagine alternate histories or universes. So this is a breakdown of the types of stories that you see in science fiction. These are things that you can come across a lot. And I'm sure that you've heard about some of these things in movies, in games, in other books. For example, a book that became popular a couple years ago was Ready Player One. It was about an immersive virtual reality after basically an apocalypse used up all of the resources on Earth. People had a hard time enjoying life, so the virtual world was made as like a way to escape. And the plot has to do with sort of people asking, is it good that this escape exists for people, especially if the world outside is so bad that people can't imagine really spending much time living there? Why not improve the world before it becomes too late and we get to this point in time? Okay. Let's see. Am I forgetting something? No. Okay. This slide, number 8, explains some of the background of science fiction, and then we get a list of some authors that have contributed to the genre from early on. So they tell us that science fiction has roots going back to the early 1800s. And then they give you an example of some of those authors. So that's Mary Shelley, who did Frankenstein. And then we also get Edgar Allan Poe, who is like a Gothic writer. Some of his stories dip into science fiction because they involve technology. But even though they give you these examples, the experts don't really know who came up with the first science fiction story. Lots of people were writing, being published or not published, depending on what time. It was very often that some of these authors were not popular and were only published after they died, when someone else thought that their work was good. So there's no real timeline of when the first science fiction story came out. But one of the authors that's being considered as the inventor of the genre is Jules Verne, and they give you some information about why that might be. So pretty much, most of the books that Jules Verne wrote were science fiction. So he spent a lot of time reading about technology and learning about things and incorporating them into his works. So a lot of people consider that he would be considered, or that he would be named the inventor, because he wrote so many science fiction things. It wasn't just a one-off that they did to be interesting or scary. He consistently, that means like very often and repeatedly, wrote about technology and how it could change things in the future in his books. So they give you a few of his books as examples. Journey to the Center of the Earth from 1864, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in 1870, and Paris in the 20th Century, which he wrote in 1863. Now, it's important to note that all of these have to do with technology that was not available at the time. There was no way to go that deep into the ocean at the time. There was no way to get to the center of the Earth. And Paris in the 20th century just imagines what Paris would have been like in the 1990s. And they give you a little detail about that last one. It says here, this last novel, so they're talking about Paris in the 20th century, had all the trappings of a good science fiction story, including futuristic utopias and dystopias. So that means worlds that were perfect and that were miserably not perfect. Advanced technology and changing social structures. So he wrote about a futuristic Paris of 1963. So he was imagining what Paris would be like 100 years into the future. And then it says he managed to predict the invention of cars, elevated trains, and even computer-like machines. Now, in terms of notes for this section, I would definitely write down that early science fiction authors include Mary Shelley and then Frankenstein, that's her book, and some of Edgar Allan Poe's stories. They don't name any, so you don't have to have that in your notes. For Jules Verne's section, I would list those 3 books in the years that they came out in case there are any questions about which of these books was written by Jules Verne. You might get that on the mastery test. Let's see. Okay, so on this slide, slide number 9, they talk about heavyweights. That means people who had a lot of influence over science fiction in Britain. So they're comparing, like heavyweights from boxing to like how important these writers were. So they start off with Robert Louis Stevenson and then H.G. Wells, who is the title and subject of the overall lesson. So for Robert Louis Stevenson, they tell you about his book, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which he published in 1886. Now, this is a book that a lot of people have at least heard of or heard references to or jokes, but it doesn't come up that often anymore. So we're going to go over the summary of the book that they give you here in this paragraph. It says, the novel tells of the experiments of Dr. Henry Jekyll, who tries to separate his good side from, his evil side from his good side by drinking a special potion. So this is the technology part. He has apparently been able to make a potion that can separate the evil side of him from the good side of him. Now it says, eventually he loses control over his evil side, which often takes over his mind and body to commit evil deeds. And you can tell that by the title. They give you the cover of the book here. And the idea is, this is Dr. Jekyll and his evil side, Mr. Hyde here. Now it says here, this was one of the first novels to explore psychopathology. So that's the study of mental disorders. And that was a field that was up and coming during the late Victorian era. So this is one of the first novels ever to consider that there could just be something mentally wrong with a person that causes them to obsess with things or have awkward or dangerous behavior. And basically he came up with, he called his mentally ill side his evil side. And by trying to come up with a potion that would separate them, he was basically trying to cure himself of mental illness by taking this potion. So that's pretty much what the technology is here. A lot of people can relate. We have like a lot of medications that can help suppress issues that people have on the inside and how they affect everyone's day-to-day life. But even so far back as 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson was highlighting that some illnesses just can't be fixed, and sometimes trying to fix them just makes things worse, especially because things that happen with people mentally and spiritually were considered to a certain degree like the realms of God. Okay, and then on slide 10, we move over to talking about H.G. Wells. So there's a lot more here about him, especially because we're looking at a lot of what he wrote in this lesson. So pretty much, he wrote a lot of, it says pioneering science fiction novels here. Now by pioneering, they mean that he wrote things that had only showed up for the first time when he wrote them. So The Time Machine is one of his most famous works. And it talks about time travel, which was very new at the time. And it also talks about human evolution in the future. And there's a dystopian world. So this wasn't the first novel to talk about different races in the future and a dystopian world. But he did write about time travel in a way that was not written about before, from like that very sciencey technology point of view. And then they give you information about his other famous stories. One of them is War of the Worlds, which talks about aliens and interplanetary wars, and The Invisible Man, which introduces pretty much one of the most iconic characters. So like the idea of the Invisible Man is something that can be traced back to him. Lots of people make jokes and talk about what people would do if they were able to have invisibility as a power. And he is the man, H.G. Wells here, that came up with that as a concept. And pretty much most of his books have inspired a lot of comics, films, and TV shows. Alien wars is a thing that pops up, especially in a lot of video games these days. Things like if you do play games, things like Halo, things like Mass Effect, those kind of things can all be said to be traced back to this as an idea. Time travel and time like mechanics are in lots of movies and games now. And he definitely was the first person that arranged it in the way that we know it today, with people hopping into a machine to see what things are like in the past or the future. And then in it says here at the bottom that the novel, and they're talking about the Invisible Man, that the novel, The Invisible Man, also repeats a theme from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is society's reluctance, that means hesitating or not wanting to accept the unfamiliar or unnatural. However, the title character in Wells's novel, The Invisible Man, is a lot less sympathetic than the creature in Frankenstein. So it's a lot harder to feel for that character. And there's another slide that is coming up. It might be the next slide, actually. And I believe on the next slide, we're going to go through the plots of these stories. So I'll try to go through that with you guys. Let's see here. Okay. So before we get to the details about his stories, they want to stop on slide 13 and give us information about him as a person. So these are the important points to know about him. The HG stands for Hubert George. He was born in 1866. And actually, he was into the sciences first before he was a writer. He studied biology at the Normal School of Science. And he met and was taught by a man called T.H. Huxley, who was known for pushing and advocating for the evolution theory by Charles Darwin. This is important and it comes up later because it definitely influenced some of his stories. But the fun fact that they give you here is that his first published book was actually a biology textbook and not like a full novel. He didn't publish his first science fiction novel until 1895, but that one was The Time Machine. And it was very successful. And because it was successful, he went on to write The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. And here on slide 14, this is where we get into his most iconic works. So they go over 3 stories here. We've got The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, and War of the Worlds. The reason why The Time Machine is not covered here is because that's the story we're going to be reading from today. So we're just going to go over the major points of these stories, and then you'll be onto the reading selection. So the first one they give you here is The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896. And they pretty much just give you a summary. So the summary of the story is that a mad scientist on an island carries out really awful experiments, and he creates human and animal hybrids that he calls the Beast Folk. The reason why this is important is because this book was one of the first novels to talk about how important ethics are when you're doing science. And this is from the perspective of like dissecting animals and things like that. So it talked about why that might not be a good thing, and the consequences of experimenting with animals. So in the story, the protagonist is a man named Edward Prednick. He gets shipwrecked and rescued and taken to this island. And while he's on the island, he comes into contact with the Beast Folk, who are kind of wild monsters that try to attack all of the people who survive with Edward. Prednick manages to escape, and the novel ends on like a bleak, negative sort of note. He returns to London, and he's basically just lost his faith in humanity because he can't believe this island where this guy is getting away with doing these experiments exists. The next story that they go over here is The Invisible Man from 1897. It tells the story of an ambitious, that means like seeking out high achievements, medical student whose name is Griffin. And he basically finds out how to make himself invisible with technology. But Griffin isn't a good guy who wants to use that technology for good. He's actually really awful. They tell you early on in the book that he steals from his own father to fund his research because he feels like because he's a genius, he shouldn't have to go out and make money on his own to fund his research. So after he becomes invisible, he pretty much just continues to steal from people and take advantage of people. He also threatens to murder some of the people that he knows. He just kind of goes on a power trip and plans to use his technology to take over the world, pretty much. And so he keeps the power to himself. He doesn't want to show anyone how he figured out how to turn invisible so that he doesn't have any competition. And the novel pretty much ends when he's beaten to death by a mob who don't want to go along with his plans, pretty much. And because he's the only person that knows how to use technology to turn invisible, the technology dies with him. So he's definitely an example of someone who was greedy for power and met their downfall because of it. And the last one here, and probably the most influential one, although to be fair, most of his books are influential, so this is saying a lot, would be War of the Worlds. So War of the Worlds is a story of a narrator and his brother who are talking about the events that lead up to an invasion of Earth by an alien race that's on Mars. So they pretty much tell the story of humans wanting to welcome the Martians at first, but the Martians pretty much kill everyone by scorching them to death with like laser guns, and then the humans kind of band together to start a war with them. And the Martians basically beat everyone's technology, right? And the humans are not sure what they're going to do against like heat rays and chemical weapons that use stuff that we've never heard of. But the aliens end up dying off and having to retreat because of the Earth's native bacteria. So they catch like smallpox, pneumonia, stuff that we have built mostly immunity to as a race of people on the planet. They start becoming sick and can't conquest anymore, so they have to retreat. And this is a pretty famous story. It's been adapted into movies, like multiple movies. There were TV shows, and the most significant thing here is actually radio. The reason why radio is the most significant thing is because Orson Welles, who was another writer from the 1900s, adapted this into a radio show. So he basically paid an announcer and directed how he wanted the text read and everything. And it's very memorable because when it was first played on the radio, people thought it was real, like it was a real news bulletin of people reporting things that were happening somewhere else. So a lot of families ran for safety in like bomb shelters and were calling emergency services and stuff because they actually thought that Martians had really invaded Earth. Now, here at the end, you can see this blue button. It says listen to part of the broadcast right here. So click on that button to hear a little bit of it. And then meet me over on the next slide, slide 16, because I think there's a question slide after this. Okay. Now that you've listened to the War of the Worlds, we're here on slide 16, and we are looking at this video that explains the time machine. So this video pretty much points out that H.G. Wells is the reason why we even have the term time machine that we use now. He's the one who used it first in a major novel, which is this book. It tells you that this story is a frame story, and that's a story within a story. So when you have a character in a story tell another story, that is a frame story. A good example of a frame story would be like Scheherazade and the 40 stories, I think, 300 stories. There were a lot of stories. So it's basically a any type of story where someone tells someone else's story is a frame story. The Scheherazade example is basically she came across a ruler who threatened to kill his concubines after spending one night with them. And to keep herself alive, she told him a story every night, but left it on a cliffhanger so that he would have to keep her alive to hear the end. And then the next night, she would finish that story, start another one, and then end on another cliffhanger. So in that story, she told stories. And in that book, all of those stories were like a collection of fables. So those stories were being told inside of the book. So that's what a frame narrative is. And this video is about 4 minutes long. So it gives you the setup, and it basically gives you a really good summary of the story. So pause this video, take a moment to listen to this. It pretty much explains the entire plot because the reading is only for one chapter. And then meet me over on slide 17, which goes over like an even shorter version of it before you get to the excerpt. All righty, we are at slide 17, and this gives us pretty much like a slightly smaller version of what was in the video. Now, since you just came from watching the video, I'm not going to review every single thing here, but pretty much this is a story about a time traveler calling people that he knows to a special dinner to tell them about his adventures while he was time traveling. Pretty much. He tells them about the world that he went to in the future, what the people were like, and basically the issues with the future and how we can attempt to prevent them from happening here in the past. He tells the people at this dinner about this story. They're not sure if they believe him. He's not sure if he believes himself, really. So he decides that he's going to go back into the future and grab proof. So pretty much he asks the person who's writing the book to wait for him to come back so he can give him evidence, but he never returns. So it's left on kind of a cliffhanger, and it's written in a way for the reader to decide whether or not the story was true or possible. So since you've watched the video, since you've come here and looked at this slide, just remember to click on this link for chapter 5 and click on this link for the epilogue. And then you can meet me over on slide 18 for the analysis. Now, if you are the type of student that has a rough time with understanding the writing that's here, feel free to listen to me go over the analysis and then go back and do the reading. But it is important to actually read it because the questions that are on the mastery test will give you quotes from the story and ask you to interpret what they mean. So knowing what the story is about won't always give you the answer to the questions if you haven't actually read the story and you don't know how to interpret it. I know I say this almost every video, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands why it's important. So then we'll get to the analysis. If you need to hear the analysis first, go ahead and let the video continue to play. But when you're done, make sure you pause and go back to do the reading. Okay, so this is slide 18. We're going over the analysis of the time machine. Now, because a lot of this story was inspired by and a response to the Charles Darwin theory of evolution that was sweeping the country of Britain by storm at the time, there are references that you have to understand to get the story. So we're going to go over sort of the overall idea behind the time machine story. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about how Charles Darwin inspired the story. So starting here, pretty much the point of the Time Traveler book was to criticize what Wells thought was the unjust economic structure of Victorian society and the decadence. So decadence just means overindulging in fancy, expensive things unnecessarily. And he thought that the economic structure was unjust because of the information that I explained at the beginning about the Industrial Revolution. People who own factories were making money, but if you worked in a factory, things were not good for you. And basically, he did this in the story by having the time traveler's first impression of the world that he traveled to being perfect. So he thought, oh, wow, there's no fighting, there's no unrest, everything seems perfect, everyone is doing well. This is what the future is supposed to be like. Technology is supposed to take us to the point where people don't have any problems, there's nothing to worry about. So he thinks that at first, humankind has used their technology to figure out how to control nature and deal with inequality in the social classes. It's like everyone has resources, everyone can just have everything that they need and focus on what they want to do. But as the chapter goes on, and he continues, like looking at how people live in the future, he realizes that things are not well. So the people that he encounters in the beginning, the Eloi, as you know from the video in the last slide, they don't need to struggle because they have everything they need. So there's nothing pushing them to evolve to be better. So because of that, basically in the future, they're frail. That means like delicate and easy to break, and they're fragile. And they also have low intellect, so they're not smart. So they have machines to do everything for them. So they don't have to stretch their brain or learn anything. And they don't have to do any hard labor either. They have machines that do all these things for them. So because they aren't being active in doing things, they are not strong and they are not smart. And as we know from the ideas about evolution in terms of the like how things develop, the idea is that the skills that help people survive are the ones that get passed on to future generations. But if you don't need skills to survive because you have technology to do it, he basically played with that idea and created a future where everyone is weak and unintelligent because they haven't had to think. They haven't had to do anything for themselves. So things seem perfect at first because life is pretty great for everyone, but there's nothing of substance that's driving their will to do anything or to become anything new or to learn anything. So they actually are less intelligent and less strong than humans of our time. Okay, now on this slide, slide 19, we are going to talk about Charles Darwin's book from 1859 called The Origin of Species. So this is the book where he published his theory of evolution that we know today. And it basically changed a lot about what people thought about science and animals and how we developed, even back then. So they start kind of like breaking this down so you can understand the different ways that it changed things. So in this first paragraph, they talk about how the survival of the fittest phrase was coined by Herbert Spencer, who was a supporter of Charles Darwin. He is the person who came up with this phrase. So if you've ever heard this, Robert Spencer, he's the first person who said it. But the issue is that instead of keeping Darwin's theory of evolution to biology and sciences that have to deal with how animals live, people started applying it to other fields like philosophy, which is like the study of thought, psychology, which is study of the mind, and social theory, which is basically people's theories about how people interconnect. And that kind of made things a little more difficult because the theory of evolution is mostly meant to explain how animals survived and humans became what they became. But when you start applying those theories about how people physically develop or the different processes that our brains, like go through in order for our species to survive to other types of fields, you get theories that aren't quite right and that don't take everything about society into consideration. So this was part of the reason why H.G. Wells kind of criticizes the way that Victorian wealthy people thought at the time. The long story short here is that supporters of social Darwinism, so that's, applying the theory of evolution to how people get along, they thought that the class struggle between the haves and have-nots were necessary for human development. So they basically said, oh, it's natural for some people to have things and for other people to not have things. And even if it seems unfair, those people not being as privileged as us forces them to have to be better to have what we have. Now, we definitely all know that some people are just born into situations that are more beneficial to them. Every place in the world is different. Everyone's minds are different. And whether or not you fit in just is kind of a grab bag of whether or not you're born in the right place at the right time. But because people thought that, oh, those people who don't have anything were born like that on purpose so that they could help us be better, people basically at the time, if you were wealthy and you believed in this, you didn't want the government to give help to people who are less fortunate than you. They basically were against, the government helping out people who were in difficult places financially, and they were pro the type of capitalism where you just let everyone do exactly what they want without any regulations. Now, capitalism, the way we have it in the United States, there are some rules, like, for example, we have rules that stop monopolies from happening. You can't be one business that owns everything. And there are some other like loose rules like that that are supposed to stop things from getting crazy. But these people at the time just wanted to get more and more money. So they pretty much use social Darwinism to say, if you don't survive, it's because you weren't meant to survive, even on a social level. And H.G. Wells didn't think that was true. He was a scientist, he had studied biology, and he definitely felt like, no, these things apply to biology. They don't apply to people living their lives every day. So you can't just use that as an excuse. And this book was one of his ways to sort of clap back and criticize at that idea. And that's pretty much what's explained on this slide. They go through what social Darwinism is. It says they asserted that the winners of the class struggle would pass on their successful genes to the next generation, and humankind would evolve into a stronger species. So they were against, the social Darwinists were against government social welfare policies for the working class. They believed that these policies would eliminate competition and inhibit the evolution of the human race. Wells felt the opposite. Basically, H.G. Wells had socialist leanings. And for those of you who don't know what that means, socialism, the definition of socialism is the political, social, and economic philosophy encompassing economics and social systems. So pretty much, well, let me finish the definition. So a political, social, and economic philosophy encompassing economic and social systems that's characterized, so this is what it's about, by social ownership of the means of production as opposed to private ownership. So basically, if you believe in socialism, you think that the community should own everything that the community uses instead of people privately owning things. And that's across the board. So instead of a man owning a company that runs a hospital, the hospital will belong to everyone in the city or the state. So everyone would pay into it and everyone would benefit from it, regardless of who's working there or who is providing the technology. Now, this is different from capitalism because capitalism says, hey, if you're the one running the hospital, then you should make money from providing that service. Socialism says, no, everyone should own everything and everyone should benefit from everything. So there are pros and cons to both. And I'm not gonna go over them here because that's more of like a social studies thing. But what's important to remember is that Wells was a little more supportive of socialist things, even though he wasn't a socialist. And because of that, he didn't like the fact that the social Darwinists were basically saying, screw anyone who's poor. You either make it out because you're smart enough or great enough, or you don't. Especially because it's easy to say that when you're the one who was born into money, or you didn't have to earn the money that you have. So this came through in the book, and that's why they spent this slide and a half kind of going over this, so that you can connect it to the book. So he's anti-capitalist, the author, H.G. Wells, and you can see that in The Time Machine. It says here, this anti-capitalist stance is reflected in The Time Machine when the time traveler discovers that his initial theories about the Eloi are wrong. They do not turn out to be a superior capitalist society that's evolved because of social Darwinism. Instead, they live in a dystopia rather than a utopia. So he thinks it's great at first, and then he finds out, this isn't as great as I thought. Wells makes sure that the time traveler's initial belief in social Darwinist theory leads him to wrongly conclude. So that means in the beginning, he thought that the Eloi, who were the descendants of the upper class, have subjugated the Morlocks, who are descendants of the weak working class, and have created a perfect society with no social problems. But in reality, the upper class Eloi have grown lazy, weak, and unintelligent from lack of work or struggle. And on the other hand, the working class Morlocks have been operating the machines of the world in dark underground centers where they're confined. So basically everyone who was lower class is trapped underneath the surface in the future. And as a result of this, they are like, basically he's comparing this to how people are crammed into the apartments that families are put in during the Industrial Revolution. So because things are awful, people get sick all the time, they have to become fierce and basically cruel to survive. A lot of the Morlocks don't survive or live for a very long time because they have to like constantly watch resources, how much there is for people to eat, how many people can exist in one time with the space. And they become a lot more animal-like, beast-like is how they're described in the book. And they basically use their position underground to lure the Eloi, who are not smart, into places where they can kidnap them and use them for food. Now, the thing here that's important to note is that Wells doesn't use his anti-capitalist stance to just say, oh, the working class should just be at the top. What he shows in this book is that both of those classes suffer. People who are from the upper class don't have to struggle at all, and that's bad for them. And people from the lower class have to struggle all the time, and that's bad for them. His general point was that both classes are gonna not benefit. Bad things will happen to both if no one actually steps in to stop the rich from getting richer and help give some resources to the poor who are being taken advantage of by people who have money. It says here, his story suggests that the survival of the fittest is not the same as the survival of the wealthiest. And that's the point of the story overall. By showing that the use of machines and uncontrolled industrialization has destroyed human society, he criticizes all the people who are exploiting workers during the Industrial Revolution. And he thinks that that greed will eventually destroy human society overall. So that's the point of the story and of what he was trying to get across in that book. That's pretty much it for The Time Machine. This is pretty much the only reading for this lesson. So this lesson wasn't very long. There's just a lot of background information. I think that's it. Yep, that's it for this lesson. So let me go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, now as per usual, if you are having an issue with understanding the reading, please make sure that you book a tutoring session with me or Miss Kathy Bahovic so that we can work on helping you understand the reading. And if you have any other short questions, you can shoot them to the English@ATS.edu email, or in Edmentum, you can also send a message to me, Amber Stokely, or Kathy Vahovic, asking any questions. We'll get to you as soon as possible. This was a pretty short lesson. There was just a lot of background information. So I think that you guys won't have as tough a time with this one. So this is Miss Amber signing off, and good luck with your English class.